Exactly. I hope that everyone enjoyed the dinner. And I'm glad to see that people have had an opportunity to spend some time chatting together. Dessert is on its way, so fear not, you will not starve. It is my very distinct honor to introduce Dr. Michael Lindsay, the president of Gordon College, as our special guest speaker tonight. Michael serves as the 8th president of Gordon College, a leading evangelical liberal arts school located just north of Boston in Wenham, Massachusetts. And as he's told me before, the home to the largest weekly gathering of evangelical Christians in all of New England. I think I got that right, Michael? And Gordon is just slightly older than Eastern Christian. They've been in existence 3 years longer than we have, so they're a little bit of our older sister, and we're thrilled that Michael's here to spend some time with us tonight. Michael earned his PhD in sociology from Princeton University, and also holds graduate theological degrees from Oxford University and Princeton Theological Seminary. He's a summa cum laude graduate and Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Baylor University, where he's been named an outstanding young alumnus. Prior to arriving at Gordon, Dr. Lindsay was a member of the sociology faculty at Rice University in Houston for 5 years, where he won multiple awards both for his teaching and for his scholarly research. Michael is the author of 24 scholarly publications, including Faith in the Halls of Power, which was nominated for the Nonfiction Pulitzer Prize in 2007. His most recent book is View from the Top, and that won 2 awards and has been translated into both Chinese and Japanese. As a scholar and educational leader, Dr. Lindsay has lectured on 5 continents and works tirelessly to create opportunities worldwide for Gordon students, faculty, and staff. His tenure as the 8th president of Gordon has coincided with record years of opportunity and growth for the college community. And since his appointment in 2001, Gordon has experienced banner years in terms of enrollment, fundraising, including a recent $25 million gift that Gordon received, financial strength, campus diversity, sponsored research, athletic success, and faith expression on campus. Michael's been married for over 20 years to Rebecca, a writer and speaker who serves as Gordon's ambassador for the college. And they're the proud parents of 3 daughters, Elizabeth, Caroline, and Emily. Michael, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please come.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Tom, and congratulations on the great achievements of Eastern Christian. I'm excited to be here in your 125th anniversary year, and excited to be able to hear the good news of your Middle States accreditation visit. Those are big deals, and it's really wonderful. It's also great to see EC being named one of the top 50 Christian schools in America. I think I visited all of those schools in the course of my work, but I gotta tell you, there is something very special about EC. And it was a real blessing to be able to be on campus and to be able to speak in chapel today and to get a chance to interact with a number of the students. And it's incredibly encouraging. One of the things that strikes me about EC is that it's a place that really is seeking after striving for excellence. And you should be very encouraged by the strategic investment that you're making. And it's a great privilege to be able to be here tonight to celebrate with you. We're able to be blessed by many of your graduates who come to Gordon, and we want many more of them, so make sure to keep sending them to us. But I think that probably, one of the key things is that all of us, we want our lives to count. We want to feel like that we've been involved in something really significant. So tonight I thought I would just share with you some stories of a couple of individuals that I met over the course of the 10 years while I was doing research for Faith in the Halls of Power and this latest book, View from the Top. It's an interesting project when you get a chance to interview extraordinary individuals. I had a chance to interview 550 senior leaders in American society, including former Presidents Bush and Carter, cabinet secretaries like Colin Powell and Wesley Clark, heads of federal bureaus and agencies, going all the way back to the Johnson administration through the Obama administration. I interviewed 250 CEOs of large companies, including 20 of the Fortune 100 CEOs, as well as the presidents of the largest nonprofits in the world and the presidents of institutions like Harvard, Stanford, and Princeton. A lot of people say, how did you get those interviews? Because those are pretty extraordinary people. Sometimes it's a matter of being in the right place at the right time. I was out in Silicon Valley conducting some interviews with technology executives. I had a couple hours to kill, so I went over to the bookstore at Stanford. And I'd been there for just a little while when I looked out of the corner of my eye and I saw Karen Hughes. And do you all remember Karen Hughes? She was named Counselor to the President by George W. Bush, highest ranking woman appointed to a senior White House position in U.S. history. I also knew that she was a serious Presbyterian involved in her church in Austin, and I had been trying to interview Karen Hughes for 3 years, but I had not had success reaching her, and here she is in the flesh. So I thought, this is my big break. I'm going to go ask her for an interview. And then it dawned on me, I've never asked somebody for an interview face-to-face. I had sent letters and faxes and emails, phone calls, but never face-to-face. And it's a little awkward because what if they say no? It's kind of like being rejected for a date. So I needed to get my nerve up. So I decided I needed a little time to sort of compose my thoughts. So I just sort of walked around Karen Hughes and started thinking in my mind what it was that I was going to say to her and how I was going to ask her for an interview. After I'd circled her one time, I thought, I'm still pretty nervous, so I'll circle a second time. So I circle around a second time and I'm trying to work in my mind, what am I going to say? How am I going to address her? And after I'd done the second circle, I still was scared, so I just started making concentric circles around Karen Hughes at the Stanford bookstore. I did this 5 times, no lie. At the end of the 5th cycle, I decided this is too stressful. I can't deal with it, so I left the store. I go out, and there's a large plaza at the bookstore at Stanford, and so I'm standing out there, and I'm thinking, now God, why was that such a big deal to me? So what if she says no? She'll forget it in 5 minutes. I'll remember it the rest of my life. So I decided to go back into the bookstore. I walk back in, and I can't find her. And I thought, this is God's punishment. I didn't have courage earlier. Eventually, I notice that she's on the 2nd floor up in the coffee bar. So I start walking up the stairs. Now, when I'm going up to her, I'm thinking, now how should I address her? Do I say, Madam Counselor, or Counselor Hughes, or Mrs. Hughes, hey Karen? What am I supposed to say? So I'm still having this conversation in my brain when I approach her, so I just tap her on the shoulder. She turns around. Now, when I get nervous, I have this habit of having red splotches appear all over my neck and face. And the minute she turned around, I knew I had 60 seconds before I was going to be beat red. I said, Mrs. Hughes, my name is Michael Lindsay. I'm a sociologist, and I'm interested in doing interviews with people of faith who are in positions of leadership. And so I wondered if you'd be willing to give me an interview. And she said, well, I'm actually out here looking at colleges with my son, so this is not the right time. But here's my telephone number, and if you call me in a couple of months, I'd be happy to sit down with you. So I took her number. Several months passed. I call her up. I said, Mrs. Hughes, my name is Michael Lindsay. I don't know if you remember me. She says, oh, yes, the young man who turned bright red at Stanford. I said, yes, ma'am, that's me. And she said, sure, I'd be happy to sit down with you. We ended up doing the interview at the Hay Adams Hotel. It was just right across the street from the White House in Washington. And it was an amazing interview because here's a woman who had not spent her whole life trying to get into the inner chamber of political power. And yet that's where she found herself. And then when she was there, she realized she was working incredibly long hours, spending very little time with her husband or son. And she began to say, is this all that this is about? It was a great interview because it gave me a chance to hear the story of a person of faith who was really grappling with key issues. Each of us in our respective callings really want our life to count. And I had a chance to meet some amazing people. 3 individuals really stood out to me as I was thinking about what I might share tonight, of folks who I thought built a very effective legacy of influence that advanced the work of Christ and the common good. The first is a guy named Horst Schulze. Horst grew up in Germany, and he didn't go to a very fine school like EC. When he was of high school age, he started attending a technical school to try and learn the trade of becoming a hotel manager. He was interested in going into working for luxury hotels across Europe. And he was also active at his church. He was given a culminating assignment before he graduated trade school, which was to write his manifesto for the hospitality industry. And so he began working on that, but he didn't know what topic to choose or how to sort of strike the right balance. He would walk to school, so he often had time to think about it. And one day he was thinking about the sermon that he had heard in church the previous Sunday. The pastor had been preaching from Genesis 1 and 2 and really trying to teach the theological concept of the imago Dei, of how we are made in the image of God. As he was walking, he realized that there were parts of his training he was really uncomfortable with. Because you see, back then, the luxury hotels had a philosophy that the staff were seen in much more subservient roles than the guests. And so there were lots of ways in which the staff were taught things that sort of communicated a second-class citizenship. For example, doormen were taught to open the door, but then to open the door so that the door was actually pushing them against the wall so that they didn't intrude the personal space of the guest while they walked through. But in the process, the guests never actually saw the face of the doorman who was opening their door. Housekeepers were taught that when they saw a guest in the hallway, they were supposed to look down so as to not invade the privacy of the guests who were staying in the hotel. But as a result, those housekeepers really became faceless individuals. And you do that day after day, year after year, you begin to think of yourself in a lesser spot. And Horst said, that's not right. What we really want is we want to think of ourselves as all being children of God, made in His image. And so he wrote a manifesto. It was basically a one-line mantra that he said, this is what I really think we ought to do in the hospitality business. We ought to see ourselves as ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. Horst ended up moving to the United States and worked for Hyatt Hotels for a number of years in Chicago. In the early 1980s, a group of investors approached him and said, we'd like to start a new luxury hotel brand here in the States, and we'd like you to be the general manager of the entire operation. He said, I'd love to do it, but the only thing is that you have to let me build the culture of the company from the ground up. They knew that he had been very successful at Hyatt, and so they said, absolutely, happy for you to do that. And Horst did that. He built this amazing culture at this new hotel brand. And he primarily relied upon the early thinking he had done for his graduate program, that manifesto that he wrote. The company ended up doing quite well. They ended up winning the Malcolm Baldrige Award, which is given by the Department of Commerce every year. It's a big deal. And he said, the first time we got it, it was such an encouragement to us because it was like folks saying, you finally have done it and you finally have arrived. They got it after about 10 years in business. And he said, all of my competitors sent flowers and congratulations notes. But then the amazing thing is that a couple years later, we won it a second time. The first company in history to win the Malcolm Baldrige Award twice. And he said, when you do that a second time, your competitors, they don't send you flowers. They say, I'm coming to see you. Because they wanted to learn what his secret was. And so all of the leaders from major hotel brands descended on his office to try and learn what it was that was making this company so successful. Their employee turnover rate was 10% what the rest of the industry was experiencing. Employees stayed there for a lot longer. Their customer service scores led the whole industry. Everybody loved staying at their hotels. It's an amazing, amazing place of what he built. And basically Horst said, you know, I think that the most important thing when these competitors would come is that you got to get your theology right. And he would use this opportunity to actually talk about how many of the biblical principles born out of his Christian faith became part of the corporate culture. And here's the amazing thing is that he built such a pervasive corporate culture that still to this day, they use that mantra. I stayed at one of those hotels not too long ago. Horst Schulze left this hotel chain 12 years ago, stepped down as the CEO. And yet, they still have it. The last night of my stay, they slipped a note underneath my door thanking me for my business and inviting me to come back. And it was signed, the ladies and gentlemen of Ritz-Carlton Hotels and Resorts. The genius of Ritz-Carlton really comes from a committed Christ follower who is willing to bring his faith to bear in his public life. And it leaves a legacy of influence that is still there 12 years after the man has left the company. Second person that I met is a very accomplished woman. She was a very talented piano player and thought that she would be a classical pianist for most of her career. Her father was a Presbyterian minister. Her mom encouraged her in her piano. And she thought that that's really what she would do for the rest of her life. She went to go compete in the Van Cliburn competition and played this piece that she had practiced for an entire year. And she thought she did it as well as she possibly could. As it turned out, there was another contestant who also played in that same competition, played the very same song. And he did such a better job than she did. She assumed that he had been practicing it for a lot longer. But when she asked him about it, actually it turned out he had changed his song 2 weeks before the competition. And she said it was devastating because she had been working her whole life for this one vocation, and then she finally realized actually she needed to pursue a different approach. Around the same time that she was really coming to grips with the fact that the life she thought she was going to lead was not the life that was really going to work for her, her mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. Her family had some connections in the medical community, and the doctor said, there's no way that we can heal you of breast cancer. The kind of cancer you have, there's nothing that's going to actually heal you. At this time, it was not possible. But we can put you on an experimental drug treatment that we think might extend your life. And so, her mom entered into that experimental drug treatment plan. During that time, she was able to see her daughter graduate from high school early. She went to the University of Denver, and while there, developed a real passion for studying international relations, and in particular, the Soviet Union. She became fascinated with the Soviet Union, began developing Russian language skills, spent time studying over in Moscow. She ended up being so passionate about it, she pursued a PhD at the University of Notre Dame, and then she landed her first tenure-track teaching job at no less than Stanford University. Her mom was able to see that entire progression, and she ended up having a very successful career at Stanford, being named the youngest and first female provost at the institution, before being tapped to serve as National Security Advisor and then eventually Secretary of State, because I'm talking about Condoleezza Rice. When I sat down to do the interview with Dr. Rice, I have to say I was enormously nervous. I mean, this is a woman who is very talented, very bright, and she doesn't waste a lot of time. I met her in her office at Stanford, and so I started pretty early in the interview asking about significant moments or milestones in her life. And I said, what was the most poignant moment you experienced while working in Washington over those 8 years? I thought she was going to talk about 9/11, but she didn't. I thought she might talk about the day she was sworn in as Secretary of State, which had been a lifelong dream of hers ever since she began studying the Soviet Union. The interesting thing about Condoleezza Rice is that she was turned on to studying international affairs and the Soviet Union because of one professor at the University of Denver. Do you know who it is? It's a man named Professor Korbel. And he happened to have emigrated from Eastern Europe. He had an influence not just on Condoleezza Rice, but also on another Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, his daughter. So this man had this profound influence on 2 female secretaries of state. And I thought she might talk about that. But instead, she said probably the most poignant moment I spent in the White House happened in June of 2002. So I'm sitting there in her office and I'm thinking, what happened in June of 2002? I can't think of any major world event. Nothing really stands out. And I said, what is it that was so significant in that time? And she said, well, actually, it was a meeting that was held in the Oval Office. It's a principals meeting. So it's a meeting where the President invites the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, the Vice President, White House Chief of Staff. She said, I was there as a National Security Advisor. We were there to debate a policy initiative that a group of the President's inner circle had developed, which was going to try and do something big to advance what it was called his compassionate conservative agenda. You may remember he had campaigned on this idea, and he wanted to do something on the foreign policy front that would make a big difference. What was being debated is that there was a pandemic that was ravaging the entire African continent, the pandemic of AIDS. And what the real public health crisis was not so much that families were, mothers and fathers were dying of AIDS, but that they were leaving an entire generation of orphans. And this was affecting entire nations. In the West, we had developed the medical technology that would allow people to have a cocktail of drugs that wouldn't heal them of being HIV positive, but would extend their life for 14 or 15 years. The debate was, is it a good expenditure of American taxpayer dollars for us to spend $15 billion, which is what this was going to cost, to launch this initiative that at the end of the day was not going to heal anybody of a disease. It was just going to extend life. The President assembled his inner circle, and they were all gathered there. They were in a circle, and he went around person by person and asked them to sort of specify, what would your recommendation be? As it turned out, that particular day, the President was seated here, and Dr. Rice was seated beside him. And he'd gone around the circle so that she was the last person to speak. When she got up to speak, or when he turned to her and asked for her advice, the room was divided. About half the people were in favor of this initiative. Half of them said, it's too costly. It's not going to work directly. It's not solving a problem in the Middle East. It's not containing issues involving Russia or China. It's just not worth $15 billion, which is the largest expenditure of U.S. foreign aid in the history of the country. So President Bush said, Condi, what do you think? And she said, you know, Mr. President, I am incredibly sympathetic to what has been shared on both sides of the equation. But I think I want to just tell you my personal story. She then recounted the story of how her mom had been diagnosed with breast cancer. And because her family had access to a medical treatment, she got into this experimental program that allowed her mom to live for 15 years after being first diagnosed with breast cancer. And because of that, her mom was able to see her develop a new passion other than playing the piano and becoming very interested in the Soviet Union. Her mom saw her graduate high school, college, and getting her PhD, and landing that tenure-track job at Stanford. All the while, her mom was speaking into her life and developing this very special relationship. Condi said, there is not a day that goes by that I do not thank God I had those 15 years with Mom. And then she turned to the President, and she said, Mr. President, we have the potential to give an entire continent of children hope. We have the chance to help them not become orphans so that their moms and dads can watch them grow up. And I think that if it is within the power of the people in this room to bring hope to an entire continent of young people, if we could do that today, and we choose not to do that today, I think history will judge this as our greatest moral failure. After she said that, the room turned silent. She said it was about a minute in length, which apparently, when you're in the President's presence, a minute of silence is like an eternity. Everybody kept waiting for the President to speak, and finally, he said very simply, well, I guess we know what we have to do. In June of 2002, President Bush launched what became known as PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan of Relief for the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. Largest expenditure of U.S. foreign aid in the history of the country. And it is single-handedly the most significant achievement of the George W. Bush presidency. Democrats and Republicans alike, liberals and conservatives, all have said that was probably the most significant achievement of his entire administration. And it occurred because a woman who had been given hope in her own life was willing to speak to that in the moment when it was needed to give an entire continent of young people hope. The third person who I wanted to share tonight is a guy named Mike. Mike was born with severe dyslexia. So much so that he said he graduated from college never having read a whole book all the way through. Now, I don't know how you do that, because you couldn't do that at Gordon College, but it worked for him. He ended up, after graduating from college, being in the financial business for a little while, and then he was recruited back to his alma mater to serve as the chief business officer. It was the University of Cincinnati. He got the job at age 29. So at age 29, he's managing all the business affairs for a campus of 40,000 students. Huge job. He then goes on and serves as a White House fellow, working in the White House during the Reagan administration, and then made the move into the retail business, moving to a department store based in Dallas called Sanger Harris. He moved up through the ranks and eventually began to establish a name for himself. Someone who could actually turn things around and make things happen. In the early 1990s, Macy's was on the brink of bankruptcy, and they needed a change agent to come in and actually change the institution. Mike was tapped to be the CEO of Macy's, and he led them through bankruptcy proceedings. One of the things that he's proudest of the fact is that he had 19 direct reports during that season. 12 of them later became CEOs within the retail business. Truly amazing investment. After leading the turnaround of Macy's, he then was hired to move to Hong Kong, where he invented a new business that would allow a series of shops to sell luxury goods based in transportation centers that would not be subject to local taxation. This is the beginning of an entire industry, starting with a set of stores called duty-free shops, DFS. All of those duty-free shops you see in airports or cruise terminals, they started because of this man. He literally invented that business. He was so wildly successful that Bernard Arnault, who is the owner of LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, the luxury goods conglomerate based in Paris, said, "Would you come and run our company?" They own everything you can imagine, and Mike said, "Well, I'm not really sure if that's the right thing for me to do." But he really felt compelled to try and make a positive difference in that particular corporate climate. He was serious about his Christian faith, and he knew that there were relatively few CEOs of large companies who were also Christians in Europe. So he moved there. During the time that he was in Hong Kong, and then throughout the time that he was in Paris, he had developed a debilitating spinal condition. It was this weird neuromuscular disease that manifests itself in many different ways, but principally, it's painful for him to walk. So much so that today, if Mike were to have to make it from that entrance to this podium, he really could not walk that distance without leaning on someone or getting around on one of those Segway scooters. He owns 8 of them, uses them all over the place. But Mike, after being at Macy's and then duty-free shops and then LVMH, was recruited to be the CEO of JCPenney. They were on the brink of bankruptcy, and it was an iconic American brand. The first day that he was going to be named as the CEO, it actually caught him by surprise. It was at a meeting of all the associate leaders that they had that were gathered at their corporate headquarters in Plano, Texas. And he found out really about 10 minutes before they had this event that they were going to introduce him. He said, "I walked into the room and I realized we have a real problem because they had me seated on the main floor, but there were 4 steps to get up to the podium, but there was no handrail." And he said, "I did not know what I was going to do." So he prayed about it and decided he would try an experiment. So they introduced him and said, "Mike, come on up there." he said, he motioned to the guy who was at the stage to come down the stairs. So the guy came down the stairs, and he gave Mike the microphone. Mike stood up and turned around to face all the associates, and he said, I want us to do something a little bit different. It's just an experiment, and I want to ask you to help me with something. He said, I'd like to ask everybody in the room to just bow their heads and close their eyes for just a second. Now, everybody's thinking, is he about to say a prayer, or is this a confession? What's going on? But he got everybody to do that. And then, after 30, 45 seconds later, he's standing behind the podium, and he said, okay, open your eyes. He said, the reason I had you do that is because I have a problem. And I didn't want you to see me and see my problem as the first thing of your interaction with me. But what you need to know is that while your eyes were closed and your heads were bowed, I literally got down on my hands and knees and crawled up the stairs here. And the only way I got onto this, behind this lectern, is I pulled myself up. Because you see, I have to lead with a limp. I can't actually walk like the rest of you. And if we're going to do this effectively, if we're going to help this company rebound where it needs to go, we're going to have to be able to trust one another. And it starts today. Mike ended up serving as a CEO for 8 years, took it from the brink of bankruptcy so that the time when he retired in 2012, JCPenney had higher customer service scores than Nordstrom's. And they had higher employee engagement scores than Starbucks. 2 out of 5 American families were doing business with JCPenney every year. It was an amazing transformation. I asked his executive assistant one day when she was walking me back to his office, is Mike a different kind of leader than you've experienced before? And she said, oh, it's night and day. And I said, why? And she said, well, it sounds kind of corny, but I have to say that with Mike, we know he loves us. And that comes across the way he interacts with us every single day. Mike's a very serious Christian, and I think he takes great pride in thinking that he may have made a positive difference in corporate America by just leading with love. Each of us want to make our life count. We may not be the CEO of JCPenney. We may not become the National Security Advisor. We may not be the founder of Ritz-Carlton Hotels and Resorts. But we may very well be investing in the next generation of young people, one of whom does something like that or even more. The reason why I care about Christian education, the reason why I want to be here with you on a Friday night, is because a school like EC is committed to excellence and committed to faithfulness. And so it's a wonderful combination that just might produce the next Horst Schulze, or Mike Ullman, or Condoleezza Rice. I've told you the story of 3 individuals who in many ways embodied the cardinal virtues of the Christian faith. Horst Schulze, who took a theological idea, the doctrine of the Imago Dei, and wove it into the organizational culture of Ritz-Carlton. He brought his faith to bear on his public life. Or Condi Rice, who was able to take her own personal story and help create an environment where she was able to help give hope to an entire generation of young people across the continent of Africa. Or Mike Ullman, who builds a company culture, even among a Fortune 100 company, that's grounded in an ethic of love. Faith, hope, and love. What we're seeking to do as partners in Christian education is to invest in the next generation of young people who would have the kinds of experiences, background, preparation, and hunger for bringing faith, hope, and love to their respective callings. There's probably never been a generation of Christ followers who have been blessed with more opportunities, resources, blessings, and good health and good education as those who are committed to Christ living in the United States today. We are the richest, healthiest, best educated group of Christ followers that's ever walked the face of the earth. But Scripture says, unto him much is given, much is required. Tom didn't ask me to say this, but I'll say, I really want to challenge you. Tonight is about trying to secure support for important investments, tuition dollars that make it possible for students who otherwise couldn't afford to be at EC to be able to be here. And so I hope that as you think about the kind of strategic investment you get to make in EC, you're reminded that you're investing in those kind of people who can bring faith, hope, and love, not just for the advancement of the gospel, but also for the common good. God bless you all.